Oh, good to see you. Long time no see. Before we continue to the next chapter, let's take a minute and look back. Test yourself. As we mentioned, if we're only passive, our learning is not very efficient. The test is very simple. Can you speak to the mirror, to your friend, to your family, for 60 seconds about one of the things we learned? The Tanakh. What is the structure? How many books? How is it divided? Who wrote it according to Jewish tradition? Shabbat. 60 seconds of instructions to your tourist before Shabbat. Your tourist from India. You're saying Shabbat Shalom. You're saying goodbye before you send them to the hotel at 5 o'clock. What do you say to them? What is allowed and what is not allowed on Shabbat? What is the order of things? What is Kiddush? What is Havdalah? Can you take any of these titles that were on this slide? If you mute this slideshow, are you able to speak 60 seconds on each title on the slideshow? If you cannot, I beg you, please, pretty please, don't continue. If you can, then welcome. We are now coming into the next and main chapter of the book of Genesis, which will have to do with the patriarchs. We will give it 2 chapters here. The first chapter will be Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, the beginning of a family, and then we'll continue in the next chapter to the stories of Jacob. So the main part of the book of Genesis, chapters 12 to 50, as we mentioned at the end of our last chapter, has to do with the patriarchs, with the story of one specific, super important family. The family of the patriarchs and matriarchs. Who are the people in this family? Terah is already introduced in the book of Genesis chapter 11 as the head of a family, the father of Abraham, of Nahor, and of Haran, who all take wives and build their own families. From this diagram, please, you have to remember, if you don't, and of course I know in this wonderful class we have all kinds of people. You have people here watching me and saying, please give some respect to my intelligence. But you're not the only ones here. And if in the exam you will not know who Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Esau are, even if you got all the rest of the answers correct, for not knowing such basic things, you may fail. And it's something we must say. And you have common sense. You know what's important and what's not. You don't need to know everything on this table over here, but a basic idea of this family, which will be in the foundation of the 3 monotheistic religions. Something to notice in this diagram that we made together here. Every generation in the book of Genesis until Jacob has one individual person who is chosen or who chooses to be connected to God and not in the race of technology and development and wars. For example, Hanoch. For example, Shet, Noah, Abraham. And in Jewish tradition it continues in the Tanakh to Isaac and to Jacob. every time one individual who keeps that original connection between God and man. But then something changes. From Jacob, it will go to all of his sons. Jacob will also be called Israel, and all the sons of Israel that will become the nation of Israel will be continuing the message according to this grand narrative, going from the whole world into a family, and then into the people who will bring the message to the world. So that's kind of in a nutshell the story of the Torah, the story of the Tanakh. And we will be starting now with the story of Abraham. Abraham, born in Ur-Kasdim. Kasdians is a name in the Torah and the Bible in general for the Babylonians. And probably the place called Ur, where the Euphrates and the Tigris meet, that is the place that is mentioned here in the book of Genesis. There are also other alternatives in Turkey. And Abraham and his family, Terach, Nahor, Haran, they all take this journey to a place called Haran, in South Turkey. And there will he get the commandment. Lech lecha, thou shalt go. From there, he takes his wife Sarah, his orphan nephew Lot, and goes on a journey to the promised land. That would be the natural place to begin, but I wish to begin elsewhere. 5 chapters after, Genesis chapter 17. In Hebron, where the name of Abram changes to Abraham. In the divine revelation, Abraham gets this new name. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. Why? One of many examples that you cannot understand in translation, but only in the original language in Hebrew here. For you shall be the father of a multitude of nations have I made thee. לא יקרא עוד את שמך אברהם, והיה שמך אברהם. Av in Hebrew, father. Ham is the beginning of a Hebrew word, Hamon. And the Hebrew original text says, Ki av Hamon goyim netaticha. You will be a father of multitude of nations. And I wish to start with this fact, that this prophecy, that Abraham will be a father to multitude of nations, as a fact in the 21st century. The majority of humanity sees Abraham as a biological or spiritual father, as a threshold, as a starting point of faith. If we go to Islam, for example, and this is one of many, who has a better religion than he who submits himself entirely to Allah? And he is the doer of good to others, and followers the faith of Ibrahim. Ibrahim is Abraham, of course, in the Quran. The upright one, and Allah took Ibrahim as a friend. Abraham in the Quran has 2 extra names. One is called Khanif. Khanif in Arabic means a man who believed in Allah before any institutionalized religion. And what it says here, a friend of God. Khalil Allah. That's why also Hebron is called Halil. Khalil, friend of God, named after Abraham, was buried there. By the way, when you go into Jaffa Gate, the main gate where you enter the old city of Jerusalem, tourists called it Jaffa Gate in the 19th century because they came from the port of Jaffa. But the original name is inside the gate in Arabic, and what does it say? La Allah ila Allah. U Ibrahim Khalil Allah. And the name of the gate, Bab Ibrahim al-Khalil, the original name of the gate of Abraham the beloved. A fact I like to mention, since you're entering the gate of a city, holy to all the descendants, to all the believers of Abraham. And coming back, of course, the gate is called that because it also leads to Hebron, and not only Jaffa. Coming back to the Quran, to Islam, 5 times a day, will a Muslim believer say a prayer to Abraham, to Ibrahim Khalil Allah, the friend of God. So, having said a word in Islam, also in Christianity, of course, tell me, how does the New Testament begin? What is the first verse of the New Testament? Remember something? The book of Matthew, chapter 1, first verse. It goes like this. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and then it continues. So what is the threshold? What is the starting point? Abraham. And it will repeat again and again in the New Testament. As a father, as a role model to all. For example, we can also open the book to the Romans, written by Paul, chapter 4 in the New Testament. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised. Okay, Abraham mentioned as father of all who believe, circumcised and uncircumcised, according to the New Testament, that righteous might be credited to them too. So Abraham, this image of the father of believers, the father of monotheism. I am stressing this before all in order to beg you not to ignore him. Your tourists are Abrahamic in their faith or seriously influenced in their culture also by Abrahamic religions, which together, Christianity and Islam, and let's put Judaism in too, although it won't be significant in numbers, create the majority of humanity. Therefore, when we come to a place that is mentioned here in the book of Genesis, that has to do with Abraham, we should open the good book. We should talk about Abraham, because that will be a very strong connection to the tourist that comes with us. Where would we go? First of all, the journeys of Abraham are all over Israel. He comes from Mesopotamia, from South Turkey. Interesting, where exactly did he come in from? Some people will tell you Rosh HaNikra. You could argue otherwise. Never mind. The first place mentioned in Israel is Nablus. And from Nablus goes down Route 60 of today in your road map, or what we call the Patriarch's Highway. And you can really mark the different stops that Abraham made. We won't go through all of them, but I will try to mention a few of them just to kind of get you into the mindset of remembering to open and talk about the foundation of monotheism, about Abraham and his journeys, because it will be relevant to almost every tourist. So, coming back to Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your family, and your father's house to the land but I will show you. Then Abram, he's not Abraham yet, is Abram, passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, Elon Moreh, Shechem. Names for the same place, Elon Moreh, Shechem. In Arabic, the Tel, the archaeological site of the city from the Bronze Age and Iron Age, but from the times of Abraham, is called Tel Balata. Balata probably comes from the word balut in Arabic, which is the word for oak, for alon in Hebrew. And preservation of the place of Abraham, Elon Moreh, Shechem, the first place mentioned in the context of Abraham in the land. And the Canaanites were in the land at that time, the verse tells us. And Abraham continues south. In the same chapter, he will camp between Bethel and Ai, on Route 60 of today, east of Ramallah. Bethel is recognized in the Arab village Bitin, Ai, Khirbet Atel. So it's pretty much where the highway of Route 60 goes today. And then there's a famine, and he needs to go back to Egypt. He goes through the Negev to Egypt and comes back. Pretty scary story over there. And we'll go after separation between two really successful people, Abraham and his nephew Lot, that are so successful they have too much flock, too many sheep, and they have to separate each to their own way. But then in Genesis 14 something happens. In Genesis 14, 4 kings of the north come to attack 5 kings of this area of Canaan. And they take all their property. And they take prisoners, men and women and children. And one of those prisoners, taken from the area of Sodom, is Lot, the nephew, the orphan nephew of Abraham. And will Abraham let his nephew be prisoner up north? No way. So he takes all of his men and he goes chasing these 4 kings of the north. And it says that he chases them until Dan and then all the way to Damascus. Now guess what? When you come to Tel Dan, you can actually see one of the 2 earliest vaults, arches in history, in archaeology, which dates to the 18th century BCE, to the city that was there in the Middle Bronze, which is the estimated time of the patriarchs. So there you could definitely talk about Abraham. Sodom we'll go back to. And for the first time in the Bible is Jerusalem mentioned in this chapter as Melchizedek, king of Shalem, Jerusalem, comes to the King's Valley. The King's Valley in other places in the Bible is a reference to the Kidron Valley right outside of Jerusalem. And there is a beautiful dialogue between Abraham and the kings of the land. A dialogue which is full of mutual respect, while Abraham holds on to his faith in his God. This idea of a place of cultures meeting in Jerusalem in mutual respect maybe can be a vision that is very relevant today too, with the most cosmopolitan place in the world. You can tell the story in Jerusalem too, because in Jerusalem, in the city of David, you can stand next to the fortress of Jerusalem in the Middle Bronze Age. Amazing. And here we have a biblical story talking about a king at that time that meets with Abraham. Worth mentioning, although it belongs to the history and archaeology class, we do not have the same names of kings in the Bible describing Bronze Age and in Egyptian scriptures, where we will find different names that you will learn in a different class. That was pretty scary. a battle against 4 kings that could end also in a different way. Abraham is afraid, but God brings him to a covenant. A covenant described in Genesis 15. In that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river of the Euphrates." This is called the covenant between the parts, since Abraham here has to go between parts of animals that he splits, which was also an ancient way of making an alliance, a covenant. And then he has this revelation and this promise of borders that were never fulfilled in history. We call this, in Hebrew, Gvulot HaHavtacha, the borders of the promise. They are borders that were never applied, not in Jewish law, not in reality, but are considered as something utopian, maybe of the days to come, and not as something that is political in our times, or never has been. Also to the issues that have to do with Jewish law that are specific to the land of Israel do not apply to the borders of the promise, but apply to borders that will come later on that are based on reality. But it is important to know in the context of the geography of where we live. Abraham gets this promise and he believes. Remember how the New Testament says he was a believer and God saw him as righteous before he was circumcised, because he will be circumcised in 2 chapters in Hebron. Let's go there. In Hebron, Genesis chapter 17, we already read how Abraham gets a new name and the meaning of a name. There he will get to bring his part of the covenant, his side. Covenant and the action that Abraham and his descendants will be required to do is the action of a circumcision. We call it in Hebrew, it is called in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, in Hebron, where Abraham gets this commandment. Brit means covenant. Milah means circumcision. So the full name in Hebrew, Brit Milah, means covenant of circumcision. A covenant between Abraham and his God, Abraham and his descendants, and the God of Israel. Of course, Abraham has 2 sons, but for the time being, only one. His son is Ishmael. Ishmael will be the first son to be circumcised. How old is he? He is 13 years old. In Islam until today, Muslims have to be circumcised, and they can postpone it until the age of 13. They'll usually have circumcision like Jewish people at the age of 8 days, but the age of 13 did stick into Muslim tradition too, as the age that Ishmael was, according to the book of Genesis, as when he was circumcised. And of course, everyone who will be born later will be circumcised according to the commandment at the age of 8 days. The first one to be circumcised at the age of 8 days is Isaac. Speaking of Isaac, after giving one of the most important commandments in Judaism, which will be really a sign of belonging to the Jewish people throughout the generations until today, here, after the circumcision, Abraham, as he's resting from this difficult operation at the age of 99, sees 3 guests coming. And the 3 guests have news. One piece of good news, which he already got from God earlier, is Isaac is going to be born. Sarah will have a son. Ishmael is the son of Agar, and also Sarah will have a son whose name will be Isaac. Another piece of news which is not so good is about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, the story, not only the story of what happened there and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but the amazing discussion between Abraham and God. A negotiation, if you want. And in this negotiation, we have in a nutshell the idea of a whole faith that Abraham is presenting. When God decides not to just do what he decided to do to Sodom and Gomorrah, but to bring Abraham into a discussion, he gives a reason. Because he knows that Abraham will be the one to give to the generations to come the way of God. And what is the way of God? כי ידעתיו אשר יצווה את בניו אחריו לשמור את דרך אדוני לעשות צדקה ומשפט. I know him, that he will command his children after him to keep the way of God, to do tzedakah umishpat, righteousness and justice. Translation may differ, but that is in a nutshell what the book of Genesis tells us. That is the way of God that Abraham is revealing to the entire world. And also worth reading either in Hebron or in Sodom, in the background of that discussion where Abraham tries to fight for justice and not allow anyone who did not commit a crime suffer the collective punishment, which will eventually come on all the people of Sodom, with the exception of Lot and his family that flee with the help of his angels. There it's very simple. By the way, many places that I mentioned, you need to really carefully read in order to understand where things happen. That's why I'm giving it some time here. Sodom and Gomorrah, it's super simple. You see in the text, read Genesis 18, 19, from the discussion of Abraham, from that visit of the angels in Hebron, all the way to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and what happens later to Lot and his daughters. And now from that story also the neighbors of Israel will be born, according to the book of Genesis, Ammon and Moab. The next place we want to go to is Beersheba, Be'er Shava. Beersheba is presented to us in Genesis chapter 21. Finally. Wow. After migration that is non-stopping, from Genesis 11, coming from Ur, from Iraq of today to Turkey of today to Israel to Egypt and back to Israel, and Abraham is just on the move all the time. He's moving. Not a moment of rest. And finally, Genesis 21, it says that he plants a tree, a tamarisk tree, in Be'er Sheva. We have also an alliance made in Beersheba between Abraham and Abimelech. They make an oath. Abimelech takes an oath that he will respect the property of Abraham in Beersheba, and that his shepherds dug the well. Be'er means well, Bir in English, but the word is Be'er Shava. The well of Shava. The well of the oath. Shvu'ah in Hebrew, oath, vow. So the well of the oath between Abimelech and Abraham. And there, as we said, Abraham plants a tamarisk tree. What does it mean to plant a tree? It means you have roots, you're connected. Vayagal sham yamim rabim. And he lives there for many days. Until, in this place, Abraham gets a revelation. which will be the most difficult test that he ever had. Some time afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Here I am, Hineni in Hebrew. And he said, Take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. Abraham sent from Beersheba to the land of Moriah. How did he walk? We know how long it took, 3 days. What path did he take? How far is it? Every reader of a text in ancient times and everyone who lives here knows. If you want to tell the story in Beersheba, all you need to do is to tell your group, take out your phones, put Google Maps or Waze, what's the distance? If you want to walk, how long would it take? Was Abraham quick to obey this commandment, or was he slow? Well, 80 kilometers in 3 days for someone who's over 100 years old is not too bad. He was pretty quick to obey. And on the third day, so it says, ויהי ביום השלישי, וישא אברהם את עיניו, וירא את המקום מרחוק. On the third day, he lifts his eyes and he sees the place, the land of Moriah, Mount Moriah, from afar. And he leaves the 2 boys that accompanied him and his son, and the donkey behind. וילכו שניהם יחדיו, and they both walk together. You see it in this beautiful mosaic in Bet Alpha, and in many more mosaics in synagogues from ancient times, and of course also in modern times. And they both walk together. Where do we tell this story? I'll tell you first of all where we do not really tell the story, where the main part of the story happened is Mount Moriah, Temple Mount. But we don't have time. We don't have attention span in Mount Moriah because we have so many things to tell there, so usually it will be like a one-liner. And here the binding of Isaac took place. But here, where can we open Genesis 22? Where can we tell the story? Beersheba is a very good place to do so. If you go to Beersheba, next to the well. Another good place to do that exactly is to ask, where did he see the place from afar and start walking only Abraham and Isaac? And then there are a few candidates. Of course, it depends on your tour program. But for example, in Neve Daniel and Gush Etzion, there's a place called Mitzpora Elif, an outlook where you can see Jerusalem when you come from south. Abraham came from Beersheba to Hebron to Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Another good place is Vehaz Promenade, Armon Hanatziv, where when you come from south you have a beautiful view of Jerusalem that you definitely will check out in your course at least once. And there you can open the chapter, and it depends on your group. What you do with it, who brings the message of the story. You do, the rabbi, the pastor, the priest. You can open it in an interfaith context. Bring the story and its meanings in different Abrahamic religions. But definitely the main story in the context of Abraham. If we want to talk about the story also in different perspectives, so what you see here is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the binding of Isaac in dialogue with the crucifixion. And of course, it will be mentioned, and a message which will be a similar message in all three religions. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. The faith of Abraham is a role model of a story. Also, if we go to Islam, a very interesting chapter. I'll remind you, a chapter in the Quran is called Surah. So the 37th Surah, Al-Safat. When he grew enough to work with him, he said, this is talking about Abraham, "My son, I see in a dream that I am sacrificing you. What do you think?" And Isaac replies, "O my father, do what you are commanded to do. You will find me, God willing, patient." They both submitted, and he put his forehead down to sacrifice him. And we called him, "O Abraham, you have believed in the dream. We thus reward you, the righteous." That was an exacting test indeed. We ransomed by substituting an animal sacrifice, just like the ram in Genesis 22. And in the Quran, this will become one of the main events. There are two main holidays in Islam. This one, Eid al-Adha, the holiday of the sacrifice. In Islam, the son will be Ishmael, and the place is Mecca. And the whole point of the Hajj and celebrating Eid al-Adha has to do with this story of the binding of Isaac, in Islam too. In Judaism, of course, this story will be read every morning in prayer. And it is read from the Torah, and the public Torah reading, on which holiday? Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, there's 2 days. The first day, we read from the Torah the story of Hagar being sent away with Ishmael to the desert. And the second day, the binding of Isaac. According to Jewish tradition, the binding of Isaac took place on Rosh Hashanah. Two things happened on Rosh Hashanah in Jewish tradition: the creation of man, of the world, and the binding of Isaac. Therefore, according to the Talmud, we blow the horns of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah in order to remember that ram that replaced Isaac, and to remember the story and to remind God that maybe we're not worthy of forgiveness. But if not for us, at least remember the favor of our righteous and believing Father. It is worth mentioning that in a modern perspective, and in a parental or a perspective of a child, it is a very difficult story. It is a difficult story to learn. It is a difficult story to empathize with. And it is also a question that can be asked, and it depends on the type of a group and what we want to do with the message of a story. One thing that is for sure, the end of a story of the binding of Isaac is a message that this newly discovered God will not allow what was very common in the world of the time, will not allow any human sacrifice. Because this is a religion of life that sanctifies life and devoting life, and not a religion of death, which will be kind of a thread throughout the Bible, opposing any concept that will introduce as part of a religion any human sacrifice or violating the sanctity of human life. After this story, straight away we come to the death of Abraham's beloved wife, Sarah. at the age of 127. Many of the commentators said she died after this from sorrow of what just happened to her son. And it's no coincidence that these chapters are right next to each other. Genesis chapter 23, the cave of Machpelah. The story of the purchase of the cave by Abraham, who has this negotiation with the whole people of Chet sitting in Hebron, and the purchase for 400 shekels that you'll definitely tell at the site. And this becomes to be the family grave, the cave of Machpelah, next to the city of Hebron, at the edge of a field in the valley. The cave of Machpelah will be the family grave for the patriarchs and matriarchs, for Sarah, 2 chapters later, Abraham, and then we'll have Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. One exception to be made from the family, Rachel, who will not be buried in the cave of Machpelah, but as we will learn soon, in Bethlehem. With that, with the cave of Machpelah, we finish this chapter where we talked about the father of monotheistic believers, about Abraham. So we will now take a break and then continue to his grandchild, Jacob, also called Israel. But first, I believe we all deserve a cup of coffee. Cheers.